My wife and I had been married for 22 years when she told me she wanted to go back to school. I want to be clear about something before I get into all of this. I loved my wife. I genuinely, completely loved her. I'm not saying that to make myself sound sympathetic. I'm saying it because it matters for everything that comes after. When you love someone the way I loved her, you don't see things coming. You're not looking for them. Her name is Beverly. Wait, no. I need to check my notes. Her name is Iris. My wife's name is Iris, and we met when we were both 24 years old at a friend's birthday party in Columbus, Ohio. She was standing by the kitchen counter eating a piece of cake off a paper plate like she was the only person in the room, and I thought that was the most confident thing I'd ever seen. We dated for 2 years and then got married in her parents' backyard on a Saturday in June. It was 91 degrees and my collar was soaked through by the time we said our vows, and I remember thinking I would have stood there all day. We had 2 kids. Our son Caleb is 20 now, finishing his sophomore year at Ohio State. Our daughter Molly just turned 18 and started college last fall. The week after we dropped Molly off at her dorm in September, Iris and I came home to a house that felt like it was holding its breath. I stood in the kitchen that first evening and didn't know what to do with my hands. We'd been parents for so long that being just husband and wife again felt like learning a new language. But I wasn't scared of it. I was actually looking forward to it. I thought we'd finally have the time and the quiet to just be together. That's the part that makes me feel like an idiot now. Not because I was wrong to want it, because I was the only one who did. About 3 weeks after Molly left, Iris sat me down after dinner and told me she'd been thinking about going back to school to get her MBA. I was surprised, but not alarmed. She'd worked in marketing for a regional healthcare company for 15 years and had always been ambitious. I knew she'd hit a ceiling without more credentials. She laid out the whole plan. There was an executive MBA program at a business school in Charlotte, North Carolina. 14 months, intensive format, mostly weekends and residency blocks. She'd been researching it for over a year, she said. There was a cohort starting in January. Charlotte was a 6-hour drive from Columbus. I asked if there was anything comparable closer to home, and she got quiet in a way that I recognized as her not wanting to fight but being prepared to. She said the rankings mattered, that the network from this particular program would open doors that local options wouldn't. She had numbers ready. The salary increase she was projecting, the promotion timeline, what it would mean for our retirement. I sat there listening and thinking, well, she's thought this through a lot more than I have. I felt a little outmaneuvered, honestly. But I also thought, she's right. This is her moment. The kids are gone, the timing makes sense, and I'm not the kind of man who tells his wife she can't pursue something because it inconveniences him. So I told her I supported her. She left in early January. The first few weeks, she called every night. She'd tell me about her cohort, about the professors, about this bar near campus where the students all went after class on Fridays. She was excited in a way I hadn't seen in years, and part of me was genuinely happy for her. Another part of me was sitting alone in our living room at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday watching whatever was on television. But I told myself that part was just adjustment, that it would pass. It didn't pass. It got quieter. By February, the nightly calls had become every other night. She said the coursework was more demanding than she'd expected. I said I understood. By March, we were down to 2, maybe 3 calls a week, and they were shorter. 20 minutes, 10 minutes. Sometimes she'd sound distracted mid-conversation, and I'd realize she was reading something while we talked. And I'd feel this low, dull ache in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. When I brought it up gently one night, she said I was being needy. That word landed hard. I'd never been called needy in my life. I'd let it go. My buddy at work, a guy named Gil, noticed I was off. We'd been friends for about 12 years. We worked together in facilities management at a manufacturing company in Dublin, Ohio. Gil was the kind of guy who said exactly what he thought whether you wanted to hear it or not, which made him annoying about 60% of the time and invaluable the other 40%. He started inviting me to his Thursday night poker games, and I started going just to have somewhere to be. It was a small group, 5 or 6 of us, rotating between a few guys' houses. Nothing serious. Cheap beer and bad bluffing and a lot of talking. It was at one of those poker nights, sometime in late March, that I met someone named Audrey. She was Gil's neighbor's sister, recently divorced, in Columbus visiting for the weekend. Gil had invited her along because, as he explained to me afterward with zero embarrassment, he thought it might do me good to talk to a woman who actually wanted to talk to me. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Audrey was easy to talk to in the way that some people just are. She listened carefully, she was funny, she didn't make things weird. We talked for maybe 2 hours that night about nothing in particular. Books, the city, how weird it is when your kids grow up and you realize you've forgotten what your own interests are. When I drove home that night, I felt lighter than I had in months. And I told myself that was just what happened when you got out of the house for a while. What I didn't tell myself, because I wasn't ready to admit it, was that Iris hadn't asked me a single personal question on our last 4 phone calls. Audrey had asked me 3 in the first 10 minutes. Iris came home for a weekend in April. I'd been counting down to it. I cleaned the house. I stocked the refrigerator. I made a reservation at the Italian place she liked downtown. She seemed glad to see me, but there was something slightly off that I couldn't put my finger on. Like the warmth was a quarter step behind where it should be. She was on her phone a lot during dinner. When I mentioned it, she said it was a group project, that her team was on a deadline. I let it go again. The sex that weekend felt like a performance. Not a bad one, but a performance. I noticed she'd changed something about herself that I won't get into here, and I filed it away in a part of my brain I wasn't looking at closely yet. She left Sunday afternoon, and the house felt worse than it had before she came. April turned into May. Our calls dropped to once a week. When I told her I missed her, she said she missed me too, in the same tone you'd used to say you missed a television show you used to watch. I stopped mentioning it. I threw myself into work, into the poker games, into long runs in the evenings that I hadn't done since my 30s. Audrey had moved back to her own city by then, but we'd exchanged numbers and occasionally texted. Nothing romantic, nothing inappropriate, just the kind of easy back and forth I'd apparently forgotten was possible. One night in late May, I called Iris's phone and a man answered. It rang twice, and then a male voice said, "Hello?" And then there was a pause and some shuffling, and then Iris's voice came on saying, "Hello, babe?" And her voice was too high, too fast, too careful. I said, "Who just answered your phone?" She said it was her study partner, that she'd left the phone on the table, that he'd picked it up thinking it was his. I said, "Okay." She said she'd call me back. She did about 40 minutes later, and we talked for 8 minutes about nothing, and she said she was tired and needed to sleep. I sat on the edge of our bed for a long time after that. I want to be honest about what I did next, because I'm not entirely proud of it, and I'm not entirely ashamed of it either. I drove to Charlotte. I didn't tell her I was coming. I told myself it was a surprise visit, that I wanted to see her, that couples did this. But I knew, somewhere underneath all the rationalizing, I knew that I was going because I needed to see something for myself. It was a Friday. I left after work, drove straight through, got there around midnight. I knew the name of her apartment complex because I'd helped her look at listings back in December. I found it. I sat in the parking lot for about 10 minutes feeling like a fool, and then I got out of the car and found her building and knocked on her door. She took a long time to answer. When she opened the door, she looked at me like I was a stranger standing on the wrong doorstep. Not happy, not guilty, just blank, for about 2 full seconds. Then she pulled it together and hugged me and said, "Oh my God, what are you doing here?" And I stepped inside. The apartment was clean. That was the first thing I registered, and it felt strange because Iris had never been a particularly tidy person. There was a jacket on the back of a chair that I didn't recognize. I told myself it was a roommate's. She'd mentioned having a roommate. A woman from her cohort named someone I'd already forgotten. I looked around the living room and the kitchen and noticed a coffee mug on the counter with lipstick on it that wasn't the shade Iris wore. And I thought, well, maybe the roommate was just here. I was working very hard at not thinking clearly. Iris said she'd just been about to go to sleep, that she had an early class. I said I'd driven 6 hours. Could we maybe stay up a little while? She said, of course. And she made tea, and we sat at the kitchen table and talked. But the whole time her phone was face down on the counter, and every few minutes I could see it light up with a notification she was pretending not to notice. Around 2 a.m, I told her I loved her and I wanted things to be better between us. She said things were fine. I said they weren't fine, that we talked for a combined total of maybe 4 hours in the past 6 weeks, that I felt like I was disappearing from her life. She got that look on her face, the one I'd started to recognize as her deciding how much of a fight she wanted. And she said I was being dramatic, that this was temporary, that in 8 months she'd be home with a degree and a better job, and we'd look back on this, and it wouldn't seem like anything. I went to sleep on the couch. In the morning I woke up to the sound of her talking quietly in the bedroom. The door was closed. When it opened, she was on her phone and she said she had to go to campus for a study session and that I was welcome to hang around. She'd be back by afternoon. I said I'd drive home. She kissed me on the cheek and left. I sat in her apartment alone for about 20 minutes. I'm not going to pretend I didn't look around. I did. I'm not proud of it. I found nothing definitive, no notes, no cards, nothing that screamed anything at me. But I found a second toothbrush in the bathroom that wasn't the spare I'd bought her when she moved in, and on the bathroom shelf, a bottle of cologne. I drove home. I spent the next 3 weeks doing something I'd never done in 22 years of marriage, which was research. I'm not talking about anything illegal. I'm talking about paying attention. I started noting the exact time she called and how long we talked. I went back through 6 months of our joint credit card statements and found charges in Charlotte at restaurants I'd never heard of on evenings she'd told me she was studying. Not extravagant places, just places, 2 people having dinner. I called a number that Gil had given me once as a joke and found out it wasn't actually a joke. A private investigator named someone who I'll just call a professional, who spent 2 weekends doing what professionals do. He sent me a file. I didn't open it for 4 days. When I finally did, I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of whiskey I didn't drink and read everything. There was a man in her cohort, 31 years old, divorced, who she had been spending significant time with outside of class. There were photographs. None of them showed anything illegal. All of them showed everything I needed to know. I closed the laptop. I finished the whiskey. I went upstairs and I slept. Actually, slept for 8 hours, which was more than I'd managed in 2 months. I think my body just needed to finally know. The next morning I called my brother, who is a CPA, and I called the divorce attorney. In that order, I want to explain something about that order because it matters. I wasn't being vindictive. I wasn't trying to punish her. I was trying to protect myself and I was trying to do it quietly because I had 2 kids who were going to find out eventually that their parents were getting divorced and I did not want them to find out the ugly version. I wanted to handle this with as much dignity as I could manage, which turned out to be more than I expected and less than I hoped. Over the following 3 weeks, I did what needed to be done. I consulted with the attorney about our assets. I moved a significant amount of my personal savings, money I'd inherited from my father and kept in a separate account, which my attorney confirmed was legally mine to move, into a new account she didn't have access to. I gathered documents. I was quiet and methodical about it in a way I'd never been about anything emotional in my life. Every morning I got up, went to work, came home, ate dinner, and did not tell her anything was coming. She called twice a week like nothing was wrong. I answered like nothing was wrong. The last call we had before I filed, she told me she was thinking about extending her stay in Charlotte through the spring semester for an optional capstone track. She said it would look good on her resume. She asked if I thought that was a good idea. I said, "Sure, Iris, do what's best for you." She said, "You're the best, babe. I don't know what I'd do without you." I filed 3 days later. She found out when the papers arrived at her Charlotte apartment. She called me within an hour, and this time she did not take 40 minutes to call back. I let her ring. She called again. I let it ring. She sent a text that said, "Please call me, we need to talk." I sent back a single message that said my attorney's name and number and nothing else. She drove home that weekend. I knew she would. I'd stayed at Gil's. The thing is, I didn't hate her. That's the part I've had the hardest time explaining to people, including myself. I didn't hate her. I was devastated. I was hollowed out in a way that I still haven't completely recovered from 7 years later. But there was no version of this where I screamed at her or threw things or made a scene. I'm not wired that way. The version I was capable of was the version I executed, which was quiet and thorough and final. We talked eventually, a few times, over the phone through the early months of the process. She cried a lot. She said she'd made a terrible mistake. She said the man in Charlotte had meant nothing, that she'd been lonely and overwhelmed and had made choices she was ashamed of. She said she'd never stopped loving me. I believed all of that, actually. I believed every word of it, and it didn't change anything, and I think that surprised her. She'd expected me to be broken enough to take her back. I was broken. I just wasn't that kind of broken. What I didn't tell her, because it wasn't relevant, because it wouldn't have helped, because it was mine, was that about a month after I filed, I'd called Audrey. Not for any particular reason, just to talk. She'd answered on the second ring and said, "I was wondering when you'd call." And I'd laughed for the first time in what felt like a very long time. Audrey and I didn't start dating right away. We took it slow. We talked on the phone for months before we even saw each other again in person. She knew what I'd been through, at least the broad strokes, and she didn't push. When we finally did meet up again, she was the same as I remembered. Easy to be with, genuinely interested, paying attention. The contrast with what I'd been living through was not something I could ignore. We've been together for 6 years now. I know Iris has been watching, at least a little, through the peripheral channels that divorced people inevitably have. The kids, the occasional mutual acquaintance who doesn't know to stay quiet. She knows things worked out for me. I don't say that with any satisfaction. I say it because I think it completes the picture honestly. What I know about Iris now comes from what Caleb and Molly share when they feel like sharing, which I don't encourage or discourage. The man in Charlotte didn't last past the end of the program. There were others after him, apparently. She's still in marketing, still at roughly the same level she was at when she left for Charlotte. She finished the MBA, but the promotion she'd projected never fully materialized. She lives in an apartment in Columbus, a nice one, and by all accounts she's doing okay. Not badly. Just okay. I'm not going to pretend that doesn't land somewhere in my chest when I think about it. It does. Not because I want her to be suffering. I genuinely don't. But because I remember standing in that kitchen when she first told me about Charlotte, thinking about how proud I was of her ambition, how much I wanted to support her dream, and I think about all the phone calls I waited for that didn't come, and all the evenings I sat alone in a house that should have been full of her, and all the times I told myself I was being needy, when really I was just being a husband who missed his wife. Those things happened. I lived them, and then I made a decision, quietly and without theatrics, and I moved forward. Audrey and I are getting married in the spring. Caleb is standing up with me. Molly is doing a reading. It's a small ceremony, just family and close friends, at a venue outside Columbus where the trees are good in May. I don't have a grand conclusion to offer you. I'm not a wise man dispensing lessons. I'm just a guy who had a marriage and lost it in a way he didn't see coming and then figured out how to have a life anyway. What I tell you, if you're somewhere in the middle of your own version of this, is that the quiet version of yourself, the one that doesn't yell, doesn't beg, doesn't make it a performance, that version of you is not weak. That version of you is the one who gets to walk out of the room with his head up. That version is the one who gets to move on. I've had 7 years to think about what actually happened between Iris and me, and I stopped trying to assign all of it to her. That's not me being generous. That's just being honest. The truth is that 2 people build a marriage together and 2 people let it fall apart, even if the breaking point belongs to only one of them. What I've come to understand is that the breaking point isn't the whole story. It's just the end of one chapter of it. What I know about choices, real choices, not the ones you make when everything is easy, is that they only reveal themselves under pressure. I could have fallen apart when I drove back from Charlotte with that cologne bottle sitting in my memory. I could have begged. I could have made it ugly. There were nights in the weeks after I filed when I wanted to call her and say things I couldn't take back, and I didn't. And I'm grateful for that now in a way I couldn't have articulated then. What you do when you're in pain is the truest version of who you are. I found out I was quieter than I thought, more methodical, more willing to let go than I'd ever had to be before. That's what I mean about intelligence mattering in ways that have nothing to do with being smart. I wasn't brilliant. I was just paying attention. I noticed that the calls were getting shorter. I noticed the jacket on the chair. I noticed the toothbrush. I didn't dismiss those things the way I wanted to, the way it would have been easier to. Paying attention when it costs you something. That's a different kind of discipline than just being observant when everything is fine. Most people don't find out what they're actually capable of seeing until they're in a situation where looking directly at it might break them. What I want to say to anyone who's sitting where I was sitting in that kitchen, at that table with that glass of whiskey they're not drinking, is this, the version of you that keeps it together, is not the version that's in denial. It's the version that has decided without any fanfare that you are going to survive this and come out on the other side of it intact. That version is available to you. You don't have to perform strength. You just have to make one quiet decision at a time. Iris made her choices. I made mine. And the thing about choices is that they compound. Every small decision she made to prioritize something other than us added up. Every small decision I made after I filed. To not retaliate. To protect my kids from the worst of it, to call Audrey when I was finally ready, to take it slow. Those added up too. 7 years later, I'm getting married in the spring with my kids standing next to me. Not because life is fair, because I did the work, one unglamorous day at a time, to get somewhere worth being. That's all any of us can do. Show up clearly. Pay attention. Make the quiet choice when the loud one is right there waiting.